Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is David Thoreau. I'm the president of the C.S. Lewis Society of California. I'm delighted to have you all here with us tonight. Our program is going to discuss the international best-selling book, 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos by Jordan B. Peterson. And for those of you who are new to C.S. Lewis Society, we're a nonprofit organization. Our focus is Christian education and cultural transformation. We're interested in digging deeper to understand life, the works, and ideas of C.S. Lewis and others who address philosophical, cultural, literary, theological, and many other aspects of the issues facing mankind. We're interested in stimulating and advancing public interest of the life, work, and ideas of Lewis, promote both popular and scholarly study and writing about such topics, sponsor and organize events such as tonight and others, and network with other organizations that share an active interest in such topics. Our website is lewissociety.org. We invite you to frequent it. I think you'll find it as a great repository of articles and videos and a great deal more, not just about Lewis, but many of the kind of topics that we're discussing. We're proud of the fact that we have, I believe, virtually all of the books by Lewis and books about Lewis with access of how to get copies. Some of them are free online. So for tonight, I should preface it, many of you may well know that the Independent Institute had the pleasure of hosting an event about a month ago with Jordan Peterson. It was called An Evening with Jordan B. Peterson, The Meaning and Reality of Individual Sovereignty. It was sold out at the Marines Memorial Theater and Club in San Francisco. We were delighted to have our speaker and discussion leader, Paul Vander Klay, as an attendee, and also he hosted a meetup group in the club just prior to our event. Paul is the pastor at Livingstone's Christian Reformed Church in Sacramento. He hosts a very popular YouTube channel that discusses Peterson and Lewis and others. He's an active blogger. I'd like to introduce Mark Hoffman, who will give us a little bit of more background on Paul.
You all are probably reading slides up front, and that's important to acknowledge. I'm excited about what Paul's here to help us not only hear and discuss about Peterson's book, 12 Rules for Life, but many of you may have met Paul through interest in Peterson, whether it's his YouTube channel or a part of meetup groups he's hosted. I've known Paul for 5 years after moving to the Bay as a Christian pastor in the same denomination. I've had the pleasure of not only calling Paul friend and mentor, but really am excited for us to get to discuss tonight. For those who are watching the Lewis Society Book Club, of which this is an event, tries to find a balance between presentation and important information, but also discussion. And I hope tonight you'll see, if you've never watched Paul's YouTube channel or had the privilege of talking with him in person, he's incredibly gifted and skilled at bringing out questions that maybe we hadn't even realized we were thinking about. He knows how to facilitate that type of discussion-based inquiry, even through a 1+ hour YouTube video. And that's not just to brag on Paul. I think that's to really introduce what we'll be doing tonight, to not only hear some of Peterson's thoughts, but to hopefully engage in discussion together. So that's an on-the-spot attempt at introducing Paul, because you'll see what I know I'm excited to say I've seen in our friendship. So Paul, thanks for being here and for the discussion tonight. So the real round of applause.
Thank you, Mark. Well, it is indeed a pleasure to be here this evening. I actually bumped into your website a number of years ago when I was looking for something on C.S. Lewis, looking for a quote, and Googled the quote, and boom, there's the article online, and C.S. Lewis Society, that's interesting. C.S. Lewis Society of California. And just a few years ago, I was talking to Mark, and he mentioned, oh yeah, some of that's right here in the Bay Area, and I'm on the board. I thought I had no idea. And as David said, we had the great privilege of being able to not only participate in the Jordan Peterson event that was here a couple of months ago, but also to do a meetup, have a meetup group there in the building. And a few that came today, this evening, were there, but it's been a wonderful collaboration. I first discovered Jordan Peterson somewhere halfway through 2017. And I had seen this, what I call the suspender video, where Peterson was talking to a group of students who were angry at him for resisting the passage of Bill C-16 in Canada that would make misgendering someone via pronoun something of a human rights violation. And he thought that impinged on free speech, and he wasn't going to just take it. And students were yelling at him, and he remained rather calm, and that impressed me. And so I did a little bit more Googling, and I saw a video of him defending the classics in education, and that impressed me. And then I discovered that he was giving lectures on the Bible, and that puzzled me. And I thought, well, maybe he's some Christian that managed to keep his head down at the University of Toronto, and here he's got a little church and he's talking with people. And then I listened to one of his lectures and thought, no, this isn't a lecture like I've ever heard in any church. And I was fascinated by how he weaved mythology and science and psychology and philosophy together. And what really fascinated me was that as I was reading through comment section and Reddit postings, that a good number of people who had identified themselves previously as atheists were talking about how, because of Jordan Peterson, they were curious about the Bible, religion, and Christianity. And I thought, now I really want to know what's going on here. And so I decided to start listening to his videos, and he had Maps of Meaning out a number of years. The one person that I knew who had read it, Tim Blackman, who is now the chaplain at Wheaton College. Tim was a church planter with us in Sacramento, told me the book was inscrutable. So I thought, well, I'm not going to try to read that, but I listened to his videos. And I thought, I'd really like to have a guide, someone to sort of walk with me as I interact with Jordan Peterson. And the person that I chose was C.S. Lewis. And it reminded me of Virgil guiding Dante through hell, purgatory, and heaven. And it reminded me of In The Great Divorce, which is a wonderful book, a favorite book of mine, how George MacDonald guides the main character, the protagonist, through, however you want to describe it, the outskirts of heaven. And so I thought I'd like to continue to read Lewis as I continue to ponder Peterson, because I noticed right away both of them had an immense respect for mythology, and Lewis, I've always been amazed by the reception of Lewis across the board. He was an Anglican, of course, but Roman Catholics love Lewis. People in various Protestant traditions, even some very conservative ones like my own, love Lewis. Members in the Orthodox Church love and respect Lewis. And of course, from Lewis popularized the term mere Christianity. And such a lover of mythology, I thought, would be the perfect guide to help me walk through Jordan Peterson. And so all along the way, I have, in fact, paid a lot of attention to Lewis. One of the earlier bloggers to write a significant piece, and I think one of the best pieces on Peterson, was an English blogger named Alistair Roberts. And in this, I'm going to probably have to see if I can adjust my screen here. Nope, that isn't it. Okay, well, that'll help me a little bit. He started out his blog post with this quote from Lewis: "A man who disbelieved the Christian story as fact, but continually fed on it as myth, would perhaps be a more spiritually alive would in fact be more spiritually alive than one who assented and did not think much about it. And as I was talking to a number of people who had been frustrated with their attempts at relating to churches, but had found themselves enlivened by Peterson, and then I read that quote. I didn't find that quote. I think Alistair Roberts was exactly right with it. I thought, well, that's what's happening here. Peterson has managed to embrace myth and is in some ways more alive than what others have found in churches. So then, of course, my natural bent, if I find something I like, is I'm going to find out where it came from. And in fact, it comes from one of Lewis's essays. And those who aren't familiar with Lewis might know him as the author of Narnia. He's written a number of other books, but Lewis was a terrific essayist, and there are many, many wonderful Lewis essays. In fact, some of those essays are some of my favorite bits of him. It's from an essay, Myth Became Fact, which eventually showed up in God in the Dock. And when I was a student at Calvin College and Seminary, Erdman's fortunately has been preserving a lot of Lewis material. And so years ago picked up God in the Dock, and I've always enjoyed many of the essays in it. And Lewis begins Myth Became Fact in this way. My friend Quirinius has advanced the charge that none of us are in fact Christians at all. And I thought this was a rather interesting comment because Lewis kept telling Sam Harris that he in fact was a Christian, and much to Sam Harris's dismay. According to him, historic Christianity is something so barbarous that no modern man can really believe it. The moderns who claim to do so are in fact believing a modern system of thought which retains the vocabulary of Christianity and exploits the emotions inherited from it while quietly dropping its essential doctrines. Quirinius compared modern Christianity with modern English monarchy. The forms of kingship have been retained, but the reality has been abandoned. Lewis then goes on to note that Christians, it seems, even the modernist ones, through their liturgies, don't manage to jettison all that old mythology. Why on earth would Christians keep the mythology around? Lewis goes on to explain that, in fact, they do keep the mythology around because the myth is essential to Christianity. And he notes that many of the people throughout history have been complaining about this, but Christianity has remained around to complain about. The real answer of even the most modernist Christians to Quirinius is the same. Even assuming, which I most constantly deny, that the doctrines of historic Christianity are merely mythical, it is the myth which is the vital and nourishing element in the whole concern. Lewis then proceeds in his essay to talk about what myth is. And if I might summarize what I think Lewis is saying, myth is the estuary of heaven and earth. And he explains it this way. To explain this, we must look a little closer at myth in general. At this myth in particular, human intellect is incurably abstract. Pure mathematics is the type of successful thought. Yet the only realities we experience are concrete. This pain, this pleasure, this dog, this man. While we are loving the man, bearing the pain, enjoying the pleasure, we are not intellectually apprehending capital P pleasure, capital P pain, or capital P personality. When we begin to do so, on the other hand, the concrete realities sink to the level of mere instances or examples. We are no longer dealing with them, but with that which they exemplify. This is our dilemma, either to taste and not to know, or to know and not to taste, or more strictly, to lack one kind of knowledge but because we are in an experience, or to lack another kind because we are outside it. As thinkers, we are cut off from what we think about, as tasting, touching, willing, loving, hating. We do not clearly understand. The more lucidly we think, the more we are cut off. The more deeply we enter into reality, the less we can think. You cannot study pleasure in the moment of the nuptial embrace, nor repentance while repenting, nor analyze the nature of humor while roaring with laughter. But when else can you really know these things? If only my toothache would stop, I could write another chapter about capital P, pain. But once it stops, what do I know about pain? Of this tragic dilemma, myth is the partial solution. In enjoyment of a great myth, we come nearest to experiencing as a concrete what can otherwise be understood only as an abstraction. At this moment, for example, I am trying to understand something very abstract indeed, the fading, vanishing of tasting reality as we try to grasp it with the discursive reason. And he goes on to give some examples of that. And he basically says that myth is this estuary, it's a sort of an in-between land. You may reply that you never, until this moment, attach that meaning to that myth. Of course not. You are not looking for an abstract meaning at all. If that was what you were doing, the myth would be for you no true myth, but a mere allegory. You are not knowing, but tasting. And that you were tasting turns out to be a universal principle. The moment we can state this principle, we are admittedly back into the world of abstraction. It is only while receiving the myth as a story that you experience the principle concretely. When we translate, we get the abstraction, or rather dozens of abstractions. What flows into you from the myth is not truth, but reality. Truth is always about something. But reality is that about which truth is, and therefore every myth becomes the father of innumerable truths on the abstract level. Myth is the mountain whence all the different streams arise, which become truths down here in the valley. Or if you prefer, myth is the isthmus which connects the peninsular world of thought with that vast continent we really belong to. It is not like truth, abstract, nor is it like direct experience bound to the particular. Now, as myth transcends thought, incarnation transcends myth. One of the points that Lewis makes here is that, in fact, as Peterson notes many times, Peterson will say in many of his lectures that fiction can sometimes be more true than fact. What does Peterson mean by that? It's that in fiction you actually take a realm of truths and you weave them into it. You have the stories of 100 different people distilled down into one story. And essentially he says what myth is sort of a bringing that up together. Now, of course, where he will take this is we have many examples of the dying and rising God, but only in Jesus Christ do you have that in a geography, at a place in time, with people around it, bearing witness to it. You don't have that with Balder or Osiris that happens just in some mythical plane. Myth becomes fact, hence the title of the article. A couple of months ago, Jordan Peterson was doing a question and answer video, which he does about every month, and he got one particularly good question, and the question was, what question do you think you should be asked? And he thought about it, and he said, well, by the journalists, they should be asking, if you pardon the phrase, this is what he used, what the hell is going on with this? Why have my books, why have my videos struck such a chord so quickly and so fast? And in fact, part of what I do with my YouTube channel is something I sort of backed into. I open it up to what people call randos or normies, or people who just want to have a conversation with me. I have no idea who they are. They write me an email, say, can we have a conversation? Sure. I send them a link. They can schedule something, and I've never met them before. There we are in a video chat room, and usually I'll say, tell me a little bit about yourself, and out comes the story. And what I found again and again and again is people, just like Jordan Peterson attests to, Jordan Peterson changed my life. Maybe it was a relationship that got sorted out. Maybe it was For many of them, Job included down there, I've had 4 conversations with Job. He's still an atheist. He's going to church. And when the pastor said, well, would you like to join the church? He said, well, I don't really believe in God, so maybe I should hold off for now. And the pastor said, well, that's okay. But he still comes, and he still listens, and he's still figuring it out. And this from Jordan Peterson, and I think a great deal of this has to do, in fact, with what Lewis sees in myth. Myth has become the estuary between heaven and earth for thousands of people around the world via this psychologist from Canada who, when asked whether or not he believes in God, doesn't really like the question and simply says, well, I act as if God is real. And that's often about the best he can do. Now, Jordan Peterson is many people. One of the things that I noticed fairly early on is that, generally speaking, women read books and men watch YouTube. Now, there are certainly men who read books and women who watch YouTube, but 75% of YouTube watchers are men, and publishers will tell you that women buy more books than men. And so what I've noted is that often men and women see 2 different Jordan Petersons. Men find him through YouTube, where in many ways he's the mythologist, especially in his biblical lectures. Via the book, he's a popular healer, and in fact the book tends to get categorized as a self-help book. I think that's a fair description, but as we discussed over dinner, the book doesn't really tell you exactly what to do so much. We'll get into the rules in a minute, but offers more a place of evaluation for your life. If you look at Jordan Peterson's question and answer videos, often there he'll be more directive, and you'll see more of the clinician who is working with a patient to help them address a particular thing in their life. And the book has some of that in it, but it's in some ways a rather strange book for a self-help book. At the end of the introduction, Peterson tells us what he wants the book to be. I hope that these rules and their accompanying essays will help people understand what they already know. That's a very mythical idea. That the soul of the individual eternally hungers for the heroism of genuine being. Note the capital B for being. He's read Heidegger. And that the willingness to take on that responsibility is identical to the decision to live a meaningful life. Right there is the purpose statement of the book. Now, these are the 12 rules, and we're going to run through them one by one. I'll just give brief summaries of them. Stand up straight with your shoulder back. A friend of his did a drawing for each of the chapters. And actually, it wasn't until today when I sat down and copied and pasted all of the drawings that I noticed, oh, these are, yeah, they are copyrighted. These are his children. Those are his children. His oldest child is a daughter, Michaela, who is in the book quite a bit, and his son is with her. I was going to try and not forget his name. What's that? Julian, yes, Julian. The first chapter is a little bit of a controversial chapter. It's about the top lobster, about serotonin and dopamine, and it has, in a sense, Jordan Peterson's mission statement, which is stand up straight and face the suffering of the world. Don't avoid, don't skirt it, engage it, take it head on. You are going to suffer, deal with it, and have at it. Avoidance is the cardinal sin in Jordan Peterson's universe. Rule number 2, treat yourself as someone you take care of. I found this to be a very interesting chapter because I had never thought of it this way. That, in fact, and a clinician will notice it and doctors will tell you it too, people often don't take good care of themselves. They take better care of their pets. They take better care sometimes of their spouses, but not themselves. And he gets into the psychology of why don't we value ourselves? And he comes around it in his own language. He will often use the language of divine spark, which always irritates me. I keep wanting to correct him and say, Imago Dei, image of God, the Christian terms come to mind, but you have value. You have to respect the life that you've been given. You are worth taking care of. Self-worth is an understandable crisis for many. Time is short. Value the divine spark that you've been given. Rule 3, make friends with people who want the best for you. Some of these rules you probably heard from your mother or your father growing up. Keep good company. Hang around good people who will treat you well. People waste a lot of their lives in bad relationships. Don't avoid. Demand better of others and yourself. Compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not to someone else today. And again, this flows from his therapeutic practice of people. Incremental, reasonable steps. Find a goal. Pursue it. Make goals, but they need to be achievable. You can do better, but you'll need to work on it. Do not let your children do anything that makes you dislike them. I think that's one of his more interesting ideas, but the idea is pretty simple. The world is going to socialize your children. You'd better make them likable to one degree or another, and the world will be kinder to them. Parents need to prepare their children for the hard world, and unless you socialize your children properly, don't coddle them. They will suffer, and it will be the parents' fault. Set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. Just because you have 18, 19, or 25 years, don't imagine you can be the little center of the universe. Evil is real. The world is complex. Establish competence in your private spaces before imagining you can fix the public space. This is probably the most important rule, and he's mentioned it in a number of videos when asked which of the rule is in a sense the central one. Pursue what is meaningful. And the only rule with parentheses, not what is expedient. The cardinal lived virtue of Peterson is this. Meaning is his sacrament. It's an internal compass that he believes can guide you even in the iron box of this secular age. Tell the truth, or at least don't lie. Peterson is a big fan of Solzhenitsyn. Solzhenitsyn believed that totalitarian regimes can only endure when people go along with the lies. And this is what part of the reason Peterson decided not to go along with Bill C-16. The evil of the world comes down to the decision of every individual. Totalitarian societies can only endure because everyone goes along with the lies. So don't do it. Assume that the person you are listening to may know something you don't. Humility for Peterson is a vital virtue for self-improvement. We are fools because we are self-important. And if you stayed around for the VIP section when Peterson was here, you might have, one of the best things you could have done was watch him work a line. The first time I went to a VIP event when he came to Sacramento, I was fairly early in the line, and then being the nosy person that I am, after I met him and got my picture with him, I sat down pretty close because I wanted to hear what he was going to say to everybody else and what they would say to him. There was a line of about 160 people, and I was amazed at how he gave every single one of those people his undivided attention for the 30 seconds or the minute he had with them and made them feel like they were the center of that moment. Another thing that I've been impressed by Peterson, because I have a YouTube channel, people will often send me the private videos that they've had of conversations with Peterson. I found him repeatedly to, in one-on-one conversation, be extremely humble and ready to listen, even to things that I would think, well, this isn't worth our time hearing. He practices this, and this is an amazingly powerful thing to pull off, and it's also very costly. Be precise in your speech. This whole chapter is about aim. And he basically says, you need to aim with your language. You need to measure your words. Don't waste them. It's a powerful thing. And he's right. You can avoid with speech by not talking about something, by not saying the thing, naming the elephant or the dragon in the room. Speech is the logos that brings order out of chaos and makes our world. Don't bother children when they are skateboarding. Masculine and feminine must be balanced in this world. Risks must be taken. Knees will get scratched. Arms will be broken. It's part of the product, part of the process. When safetyism reigns, which is the feminine, you'll notice Peterson in general is all about balance. The masculine will come roaring back in a destructive way. Let it work out. Don't jump in and try to control. The last chapter, the last rule, pet a cat when you encounter it in the street. And this is Michaela and her dog. And if you read all the way to this portion of the book, this is one of my favorite portions of the book, because what he does is he lays out the suffering of his daughter. And if you're a parent, one of the things that you know is that if you are a good and loving parent for a child who suffers, those parents suffer in a special way. There's usually a sense of guilt. There's a desire that if the roles could be swapped and the pain could be taken from that child, they would take it. And so Jordan and his wife Tammy for years struggled with the fact that their daughter had childhood arthritis and her joints would seize up and they couldn't get to the bottom of it. Try and try again. The point of the rule of the chapter, like many of the other rules, the rules aren't always terribly connected with the chapters, is you have to face suffering of life full on, and it is hard. Take those moments of existential pleasure because they are fleeting. Now, one of the interesting things, if you go to a bookstore and look in the self-help section, the self-help section will not tell you self-help towards what. Our culture simply assumes we all know what we need help towards. Don't we all want the same thing? Self-help towards mere money, self-help towards for passing success or status, self-help for power, whether it comes through beauty or money or status or control. And when you look at the rules that Peterson has, you might ask that question. Self-help towards what? Because unlike many other self-help books, it's not about getting rich or becoming beautiful or gaining power or gaining status. It's a self-help book in the pursuit of meaning. And as I said before, meaning is Jordan Peterson's sacrament. And what I mean by that, similar to mythology, meaning is the connection where heaven and earth come together for Jordan Peterson. Similar, again, to myth. Now, meaning is not a bad choice for thinking about a sacrament. People sacrifice happiness, money, time, even their lives for meaning. We haven't talked enough about meaning in the last few decades. Nihilism is the opposite of meaning. Meaning is what propels you into action and motivates you to change yourself and to change the world for the better. All of our myths, which these days mostly come in the form of movies or stories, are about sacrifice and meaning. All of the stories worth listening to deal with that. A number of others currently are talking about what may be referred to as the meaning crisis. Viktor Frankl in the Second World War, going to the concentration camps, kept his head about him and said, "My, what a ghastly but yet teachable place this concentration camp is. How can I figure out who will live and die? It was meaning. And so on the basis of that, he developed his logocentric therapy. Find meaning, and you can survive. Meaning can combat aggression, addiction, depression, and the current one, anxiety. John Vervaeke, another psychologist out of the University of Toronto, is doing a series on getting out of the meaning crisis, trying to figure that out. Jonathan Haidt has his book, The Coddling of the American Mind. Without meaning, what is there? And that's where you see, in fact, this book is all about meaning. I think perhaps he should have titled it not 12 Rules for Life. His first book was Maps of Meaning, and this book is, in a sense, Methods of Meaning. Lewis continues his essay on myth with that quote that Alistair Roberts used. A man who disbelieves the Christian story as fact, but continually fed on it as myth, would perhaps be more spiritually alive than the one who assented and did not think much about it. The modernist, the extreme modernist, infidel in all but name, need not be called a fool or hypocrite because he obstinately remains in the midst of his intellectual atheism the language, rites, sacraments, and story of the Christians. The poor man may be clinging with a wisdom he himself by no means understands to that which is his life. It would have been better that Lucy, who is there Alfred Loisy, 1857 to 1940, a French theologian and the founder of the modernist movement, should have remained a Christian. It would not necessarily have been better that he should have purged his thought of the vestigial Christianity. Lewis basically says what Peterson has done. With myth, you have meaning. And even if you don't understand it, even if you're not that smart, even if you're just the common person going through a common job and a common life, your life can be rich and full with meaning. And the intellectual nihilist, well, what does he really have after all? Jordan Peterson is the rough man from Alberta, a pragmatist who has recognized the popular necessity of myth while nervous about the messy relationality and history of lived religion. The secular clinician writes 12 rules for life. Rules are the sort of thing that you can't live without, but you can't push too far. This is a self-help book for the buffered self. Although you'll find a lot of Bible in it, it's Bible as mythology. And when I was thinking about this lecture, I had to ask myself, did C.S. Lewis ever write a self-help book? I think he did. The Screwtape Letters. Think about the Screwtape Letters. The Screwtape Letters is in many ways a very interesting companion to 12 Rules for Life. This was Lewis's first broadly popular book. Screwtape Letters put Lewis out in public in the middle of World War II. It seems precisely opposite a book like 12 Rules for Life. Here Lewis writes a book of letters from one demon to another about how to send a man to hell. This seems strange in contrast to Peterson, who says to the question, do you believe in God? Well, I act as if God exists. Well, okay. Heaven and hell? No, 12 Rules for Life is for the immanent frame. It's for the secular world. It's where to find meaning here and now. But pay attention. Both books are about virtue. Both books are subtle and deeply psychological. Peterson, as an open and I always put God in quotes with Peterson because that's generally how he frames it. A God-fearer. Recently he did a video with Prager, who actually I'm going to put a video out tomorrow where I contrast Peterson with Kierkegaard. He's a sort of agnostic. He won't break the immanent frame. But look at what Lewis does with Screwtape. So here in mid-century England, when many people have already stopped going to church, and devils are the sort of things that we snicker about and laugh at, belief in God seems to linger long than belief in devils or demons, Lewis writes a book about two demons. Isn't that quaint? Isn't that cute? But it's a deeply practical book. Notice what Lewis does. He deploys myth in the book. A lot of scholars have wondered, in fact, because the Narnia Chronicles came late in Lewis's career, as well as Till We Have Faces, which I think is his best piece of fiction. Why did Lewis stop writing direct apologetic books and start writing children's books? This from a man who didn't really seem to know children at all. He understood myth, and he understood people. Via the drama of the ultimate and archetypal, the dramatic meaning of the minutiae of life is revealed. And when you read Screwtape, you'll see that. So the particular subject that Wormwood is trying to bring to hell, well, he's going to church. Well, don't worry about the church. Just make sure he church hops and church shops and make sure he finds that all of his elite and influential and intelligent friends have so much more than those silly little people playing around in the church with their mythologies. But the devils are subtle, and they look to lure him. It's all about those little turns of thought. I didn't bring any video with me tonight, but there's an amazing segment of a conversation on the Rubin Report where Jordan Peterson is talking with Ben Shapiro, and Jordan Peterson makes the point that every tiny little decision puts our feet either in towards the direction of heaven, in quotations, or hell. And I heard that and I thought, that's the Screwtape Letters. That's right from Lewis's Mere Christianity. Both Jordan Peterson and Lewis believe that every tiny decision of our lives moves us towards heaven or hell. Peterson's just unsure that he can believe in either of those places. What separates them are the quotation marks Jordan Peterson might add because of the secular frame. Mythologists, however, still live. Last night, my daughters are both home from college, and what that gives my wife and I is an opportunity to understand what all the kids are watching. And my daughter said, "Oh, Ben is watching Good Omens on Amazon." I had no idea what that was, and turned it on, and there's an angel, and there's a demon, and they're talking. And then a little bit later, there's a whole group of demons, and what do? And they're conspiring to figure out how to trap human souls for hell. And I thought, Lewis was a very clever man. 12 Rules for Life in the wrappings of something that college age and teenage children would want to watch on their own. So, of course, C.S. Lewis eventually, via Narnia, came not only to learn and understand mythology, but to employ it. I noticed Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman, probably the two most prominent mythologists today, were behind this series. Jordan Peterson is working as a secular therapist, moonlighting, in a sense, as a preacher. Well, what do we do with 12 Rules for Life? The book should be understood as part of the larger Jordan Peterson phenomenon. The book has sold over 3 million copies. It's obviously a very popular book. I don't know that the book would have taken off if it hadn't been for the videos. Maps of Meaning was produced in 1999. Hardly anybody read it. It's a very difficult book to read. But without Kathy Newman and C16 and Joe Rogan, I don't think we would have been talking about this book. 2 weeks from now, as we discuss this book, my question is going to be, is Jordan Peterson's myth real enough? But for now, I know some of you have said, well, I've read half of it. I'd like to hear what you have to think about the book. So that's my talk. Well, how many of you have read the book or part of the book?
Or listen to it.
Or listened to it?
Finally bought it today.
Finally bought it today. What is the book? What do you think it's for? It's a strange self-help book. Yeah.
Something more digestible than the Maps of Meaning. Something more accessible, which is maybe why you have that question. He doesn't, I won't pretend to know, but as much as you mentioned myth, he uses more practical, more real, more, I think in one of his talks, he talks about movies being an abstraction versus, say, reality TV. This one's much closer to more immediate. So I think that's what the book is. I think his great work is yet to be written. The Maps of Meaning was, I don't know. Say this book is more of a light version.
Did you read Maps of Meaning?
Yes.
Congratulations. Yes.
I would just reflecting, I think he's kind of almost like a Moses to this generation. And the thing I'm thinking of, particularly the phrase that came to me was, now there arose a generation that knew not. So he's addressing a generation that doesn't know the Bible, but in large part doesn't know Western, our whole historical Western culture there.
Mm-hmm.
And he's kind of almost like speaking to this people who have lost or don't even know what they've lost, and trying to relay what he feels is a message there.
Mm-hmm.
Instilling there was kind of like a Moses figure there, and people were attracted to Moses.
And sometimes they wanted to kill him.
They were attracted in the sense that he was saying things that they kind of didn't even realize until they heard it, what they were, it was something they wanted to hear. And I think that's perhaps what the kind of reaction, because we're definitely in a generation that doesn't know it. He's speaking a language that people probably don't hear elsewhere very much.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. In the back first, and then you.
Well, at the when he spoke at the event in San Francisco, he was introduced as the last thing before he stepped up on the stage was he was introduced as part of this tribe. He had this special name that the tribe up in Canada gave him for knowing the like. It was a mystical kind of mythological kind of name, and how he listened to their stories, and they gave him this name of understanding, the quest for knowledge, or something like that. I forget exactly what it was, but
The great seeker.
The seeker, yeah. So I just get this sense that he's really looking that toward teaching through myth. He's understand that element, and I've seen some of his videos where he's talked about how it used to be, and how storytelling and how messaging down the generations was told through storytelling, and people would really remember it because they didn't have maybe as many distractions as we do today. So poetry and whatnot was passed through generations that way. And I think mythology, I just like this modern age, people don't really have. They yearn for that kind of thing. That grandpa who could tell stories, or who has seen, because young people don't know. So it's like a childlike spirit that he's tapping into, that people are yearning for. It seems like so.
I've always been really moved by Corrie ten Boom's story, and just how here these were very ordinary people living a quiet life in Holland, in a little clockmaker shop, repairing clocks, and they went through their whole lives. They were in middle age and old age, and then World War II, the cataclysm just broke around them, and the entire family became heroes in small ways and incredibly large ways. And just that this book made me think about, he's really saying each one of us has a hero's journey. And just entering into that, what is our story? What's our part in the drama?
That's very true. Heroism is a big deal, as in that little opening paragraph. That's how Peterson sees it. That's very true. Yes.
Admittedly, having not read the book, but just listening to your rules, you talked about the childlike thing. Jesus talked about, unless you're like a child, you don't get it. The second rule, take care of yourself. Jesus said, love others as you love yourself. It strikes me that Peterson is taking all the religious schmutz crap, and he's like, on biochemical terms, an enzyme, lowering and removing the barrier to all this stuff that is a barrier to getting in touch with that real, living real with God. And he's lowered that barrier into such practical terms that it's actually livable. But he's removed the fog to give clarity in ways that can be real.
One of the things that a number of people have said to me was, well, I've been in church for a long time, but I didn't understand it until I heard this from Jordan Peterson. And I thought, as a pastor, it's not something you really care to hear. But that clarity through him has, it's really quite amazing, really quite striking.
He cuts through the crowd.
Yeah.
The phrase that stood out to me from the book that I think he uses more than once is aim heavenward.
Yes.
So I like how you compared it to the Screwtape Letters. I didn't think of that. But that's what he's trying to inspire people to do. And I agree with him that heaven and hell are states of being that we experience here and now. And I like that he doesn't make some kind of metaphysical break, like our souls are here right now, and I think that helps people to kind of wake up to their experience. And I also like that he doesn't put human nature in an either-or box. He's very stark about our capacity for evil, and he's very he believes that anyone can be a hero, as she was pointing out. Like he provokes people to heroism. So I appreciate that, holding that tension the way he does, that we're capable of both heroism and evil at extremes when we're at our full capacity, and that's what he wants his people to be at their full capacity, which means you have the power to do either. Yeah.
One of the things that you'll hear him say often is that we grossly underestimate our capacity, and this, for him, this facing the suffering of the world, if you do that, what that will provoke in you is in fact your heroic capacity to engage the world. And if you avoid or shrink, or in his words, lie to avoid, the hero will never emerge. And for the hiding place, they were deeply stubborn in that we are going to defy the Nazis and we are going to hide these people, and it may come at the cost of our lives, and for a number of them it did. And so if you will never be a hero if you are lying and avoiding. And he says life is suffering. Tend to it head on. Yeah. And take a risk.
So I've got a question. In the conversations, quite a lot of words ringing out to me. Hero, journey, confusion, myth. And did anyone else find themselves kind of thrown at Campbell after Peterson.
Yeah.
I found myself in a deep dive, and I was deeply confused actually, but I kept going. And you mentioned C.S. Lewis as your Virgil.
Yeah.
And I realized now I was casting about looking for a guide. And here's the hero's journey.
Yeah.
So that happened to you as well.
Yeah, I didn't know Campbell. Another one of our members of our meetup who didn't come tonight is constantly annoyed that Peterson never mentions Campbell. Why? Are you afraid you're giving away your secret sauce? Because for a previous generation, Joseph Campbell mined many of these ideas. And of course, Joseph Campbell was right there with the crafting of Star Wars, which became for a generation a deep mythology for a generation. So you're not the first person to make that observation. And the real question is, why no footnotes to Campbell? And there have been a couple
footnotes to Campbell in the Maps of Meaning. I called James out on that too.
Oh, were there? Okay.
Yeah.
He doesn't talk about him. Every now and then you'll hear it.
He has the footnotes, so he has next to his claims the reference, and then in the footnote is Joseph Campbell's name.
You read the fine print.
Well, I searched the fine print.
So, but that's an excellent point. Yes.
You mentioned that the book is all about finding meaning. What doesn't come through to me as well as it should do in the book is that it's very important that you find meaning in the right place. After all, the true Nazis found meaning in Nazism.
That's right.
Be careful where you seek your meaning.
That's right. And I think that is the weakness of using meaning itself as his sacrament. We have a problem in the secular frame, and you will hear him often talk about Pinocchio is one of his favorite myths. If you wish upon a star, use the stars to guide. In a sense, however, those stars are in heaven. They are in the heavens. They are not below here. And if in fact you use meaning as your guide, well, I'm finding meaning in pursuing this cause. Well, he gets into the psychology and the biology of meaning, but that gets, those, just as you said, those Nazis, they had a vision for the truth and they pursued it and they felt meaning. And so I agree with you 100% on that. Ali?
I think, following up on the point that was brought up, I think that's the main flaw in Peterson's work, and I'm a big fan of his, obviously, but that's the problem, that he doesn't distinguish between meaning versus false meaning. And in some sense, this is not a solvable problem, because his whole model of analysis when it comes to meaning and the crisis of meaning is that you got some agent that is going from point A to point B, and he graphs this all the time in his lectures, and I'm assuming in Maps of Meaning. You want to go from A to B, and you got a path, you got all these disturbances, which is the chaos, and you got to stick to your path, and then you've got the 12 rules, which is basically saying that use your abilities to the best of your power and aim for the highest imaginable best that you can come up with. But the problem with this is that that end goal is never knowable unless you get there. So there's nothing in Peterson's 12 rules that cannot be, say, applied to a suicide bomber. You can take the same book, the same 12 rules, just take out the biblical bits and replace them with equivalent, say, Islamic texts or passages that were, say, influenced by Islamic scripture. And then you would give it to a suicide bomber, and he would say, well, I gotta, I gotta respect the hierarchy, I gotta follow the best truth that I can imagine, I gotta not lie, and I gotta respect the feminine and masculine divide, and I gotta follow something that is meaningful, not expedient, and I'm gonna plan to blow myself up in 10 years. So that's the main problem of Peterson's line of work, and other people who have followed the same thing. And I would say the same thing about Lewis, that yes, myth is meaningful, and it's the the best thing that maybe people can experience, which I would not agree, but that's what they're claiming. And that's something that I think is going to be the downfall of his work. And someday, maybe not in his lifetime, maybe not in our lifetime, but I don't think he's going to be remembered as some person who figured it out. Maybe he's a great figure for our time, but there's a very inherent flaw in his line of work that.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think this whole point is a key problem with Peterson. But to me, the irony is that he knows it. That's why he leaps to Dostoevsky and Solzhenitsyn. So he knows it's not just what you choose as meaning. He believes there is objective meaning, but he can't bridge it.
Well, he actually doesn't believe in
it
objective meaning because he rightfully agrees that you cannot know your truth subjectively, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and with his line of reasoning, there would be no way of telling, say, a suicide bomber that your truth is not the actual truth.
No, but my point is that he, as Paul was saying, he says that I live my life as if God does exist. So he's saying there is this objective divine standard and reality and spirit and so on and so forth. But in my opinion, he tries to equivocate it. So it's something he knows is there, but he can't bridge it. And I think that's his dilemma.
He talks about the Judeo-Western Christian philosophy a lot. So.
Okay, well, we've got some hands up, so.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so
he was first.
Two things. I'm trying to synthesize what I'm hearing, and admittedly, I haven't read the book. Okay, I've watched a few of the videos and things like that. But you mentioned earlier in your remarks something about this. It was like a mild resentment of this phrase "spark of divinity" or something like that. I'm remembering that I first heard that back in the Francis Schaeffer era. He used that phrase.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he did. And
Interesting.
The way I would characterize what I think he was intending to convey was there's the spark of divinity that even in a fallen human being still is able to respond to the aspirations that God has for them. And while you're thinking about how to elaborate on that a bit, I hope you will. I'll just mention that this discussion also reminds me of an old Disney cartoon where Mickey brings a cat into the house and Pluto, his dog, resents it. And there's a scene where the cat falls into a well and Pluto's sitting on the edge of the well figuring out, whether he should rescue the cat or not. And these two little characters appear, one on each side. The angel character, the devil's a cigar smoking Pluto dog that says, forget it, let him drown. And the angel's, arguing that way. And finally the angel grabs the devil character, slugs him into submission, and he says, save that kitty. Pluto finally does, so he responds to the positive voice, as the sort of angelic voice as opposed to the devilish voice. So I think that's the kind of thing that the spark of divinity suggests to me, is that there is, in fact, a right voice to hear. And maybe Peterson just doesn't, say enough about it to sort of like make it clear. But
I think he hears it. It's just I'm saying he can't ground it in evolutionary psychology.
Yeah.
Well, he grounds it in English common law. Like he goes on and on about it.
Yeah. Well, but where does this objective standard come from? I mean, if everything is simply subjective.
I suspect, and I can't prove it because I'm not deep enough into Jordan Peterson, I don't think that ideology would stand up. The amount that you'd have to be to sacrifice yourself as a bomber. I suspect the first chapter would probably keep that, the standing up for yourself. Jordan Peterson's got that, his yin-yang thing, and that fascist ideology thing is way off the spectrum to where he wants us to be, right? He wants us to be like walking that line. And I come to the book with some skepticism, and I'm trying to separate my curiosity. Is he a Christian? Is he just pretending, like he's not? Is he setting up something to say, right? It doesn't really matter whether it's true. You need to believe in something because that's the only way to have a decent life. You have to believe in something and have meaning. And, is it a golden calf thing? You don't have to go to Jerusalem. You don't have to do that. This will be just as good.
No, I
think
no.
I was skeptical. I think I'm warming up to him as I get through the book.
I just, in fact, Mary next, she had her hand up, and Andrew. In fact, this afternoon I made a video because Peterson was on PragerU and did an interview, and it was very emotional. It happened, our meetup caught, one of the things that our meetup caught was that Peterson, especially around the time he was here in San Francisco, had been getting increasingly emotional. After that trip, he made an announcement that he was canceling a trip because his wife was going in for surgery, and I think that's part of the reason for that. But he did that they did that PragerU interview about the same time as that. He was almost crying his way through that entire interview. And he once again addressed the believe in God question.
When we had our event, he had just been notified that of his wife's extreme emergency danger. And so when he did our event and then Prager, he was facing that directly.
But then people send me all kinds of videos now. Someone sent me a really interesting video of an expert in the history of existentialism who walked through Kierkegaard's view of faith. And when I listened to that, I thought that is exactly what Peterson is doing in terms of, and it's fascinating when you think about Kierkegaard, who he was in his time. So if you want to listen to my channel, tomorrow morning I'll be putting out that video, putting those two videos together, and we'll talk about that. Because actually now, I think if you understand Kierkegaard's idea of what Kierkegaard thought Christianity should be in his context, that's sort of where Peterson is at. So, and the spark of divinity, part of what Peterson doesn't know that much Christian theology, and so a lot of terms are loose. But I'm going to have to look into that with respect to Schaeffer, because I'm very curious about that, because Schaeffer obviously knew more theology. Mary.
Back to Ali's point about Peterson versus Lewis's view of myth. Just to clarify, Lewis was very clear that his admiration of myth was because it points to the one true myth, and not for its own sake, so to speak.
It seems that Peterson makes the point that myth is incredibly powerful and that modern Christianity sort of misses that. So he's acknowledging that. But to me, the driver is Jesus, so many of the scriptures. Without faith, you cannot please God. And so God mandates this gap. And as humans, we want to connect the dots all the way in a reductionist manner to say, and yet God mandates this gap where it's this. Carl Jung talks about the numinous, this knowing that's not just left brain. And there's going to be a gap in how you negotiate that. And I think Peterson is swimming in those shark-filled waters head on.
I think part of it also, and I know you looked at the idea of the holy here, which was one of Lewis's favorite books. And at the beginning of The Problem of Pain, Lewis basically talks about, our capacity to know, our sense of the noumenal. And that's something that, it's not one of our five senses, and so there's skepticism about that. But Lewis believed it, and Lewis in the beginning of The Problem of Pain makes that point strongly, so I agree. Andrew.
I was just going to offer that we should appreciate where Jordan Peterson is, and that is that he's on a journey. He's not arrived, and he's made a whole lot of progress, and he's conflicted because he knows there's a moral universe. He knows we're all responsible to answer for the moral arc that is there. And yet he doesn't know how to put that in the midst of his training and what he thinks academically or cognitively about himself. So he's in a classic conflict with himself, and he's making a journey. And the reality is that I just have to wonder if his wife's situation is going to suddenly tear apart some barrier for him. And the reality is that he wants to believe. He just doesn't know quite where to be. And I wouldn't say that he's lacking in faith. His faith is ever expanding because he's discovering more and more. But he's on a journey, and so he has thoughts like any of us. He's broken, we're broken. He's got some great insights. He's got a lot to offer, but it's not the definitive word on really.
Well, you want to discuss your point that you've mentioned about Lewis's journey, and also why you think Lewis's book Miracles would be key for Peterson.
Well, actually,
or a key.
No, that's. So I started watching Peterson's videos, and one of the things that I had done over the last number of years was that I think we are immersed in a secular context, and that impacts us so deeply we don't appreciate it. And one of the things that I had always been wrestling with is how can we keep these two worlds together? And as a pastor, well, it's pretty important that I, maintain the faith. And so I started a discipline a number of years ago where I basically read Lewis's book Miracles about twice a year. Because I found when I would go through Lewis's book Miracles, that fed my faith. And when doubts and skepticism would start to creep up on me, I found the way Lewis frames the issues in Miracles so compelling that when I found Jordan Peterson and I knew that, wow, this is a real match for C.S. Lewis. And I had one opportunity to have a half-hour conversation with Peterson, and you can find it on my channel. He hadn't talked much about Lewis before then, and I asked him if he had read Lewis, and he didn't know much about him. And so I wanted to get the book Miracles into his hand, and I thought, well, I can mail it to him. And then I thought, it's not good. Now especially, I really know, given even in my tiny little YouTube channel, people send me books sometimes, and it's like, so mailing him the book wouldn't do anything. So I thought, well, how can I get some of this out there? Well, I'll start making a YouTube channel. And that's what I did. But, I thought Lewis in Miracles so nicely runs through many of these issues. But so then one of the things I started making videos about the book Miracles and Peterson, and some people really, really enjoyed it. But I see, and I think Lewis eventually came to see this too, apologetics, generally speaking, helps Christians with their doubts. Andrew made the point, becoming a Christian is not like buying a sensible used car. It's more like falling in love. And we grab onto Jesus because we're desperate. And so I then rethought my strategy, but I would love to see Peterson. Love to see Peterson engage with Lewis or Chesterton in a conversation with Zizek. Zizek dropped a Chesterton quote on him that Peterson hasn't been able to let go of since. And
he mentioned it at our event.
Yeah, he mentioned it at our event, and he's mentioned it at many of the events since then. That Chesterton makes this observation about Jesus on the cross, that suffering can be, this is how Peterson sees it, because Zizek was paraphrasing Chesterton, that suffering in this world can be so bad that even God himself might doubt his own goodness. My God, why have you forsaken me? And especially if you read the last chapter of 12 Rules for Life, where he goes through everything that they went through with Michaela. That suffering is a deep part of Peterson's journey. And so we were just talking in the car, I really hope that his wife's health can be stabilized, because his wife didn't come on this trip to San Francisco.
Yes, she did.
Oh, she did?
Yes, and she was in Santa Barbara too.
Okay. Because she travels with him everywhere, and she's a big piece of him being able to do what he does. And without her, I don't know what's going to come of him.
So the recording that Peterson did on his channel about canceling his trip to Europe, he did in their room in Santa Barbara in the hotel.
Oh, okay.
Now that everyone's talked for a bit, I can see how aiming heavenward can mean different things to different people, different worldviews. I mean, every utopian or dystopian scheme has been aiming heavenward. But precisely because he recognizes the suffering in the world, he never makes it the goal to eradicate all the suffering. That's not what aiming heavenward means to him. It means to him to be able to be strong enough to live within the suffering and not let it pollute your soul. And I think that's one reason why his book has sold 3 million copies, because that's a rather countercultural view of things. Yeah.
Well, this Kierkegaard quote that I play in the video tomorrow, faith right now, the dominant picture of it in the church is faith gives comfort and happiness. Kierkegaard, at the height of the golden age of Copenhagen, Kierkegaard had no patience for that. Faith for Kierkegaard was wrestling and struggling. That's Peterson carrying that heavy cross up that hill to the city of God. And so you're very right, and it's a different side of it. It's the struggle of the cross.
I think part of what we have to grapple with daily is this infection of society with the idea that human flourishing is like the number one thing that we want for each other and that God wants for us. And I came across it, I think it was in Jamie Smith's book where he quoted Charles Taylor, who said, "I believe God wants humans to flourish, but human flourishing does not equate with thy will be done." And I think I can really appreciate that. It's this balance again. It's not all just about flourishing in the sense that we define flourishing.
Yeah.
Mark? Queuing off Pat. Pat's a regular attendee of our book club and cheered at the mention of Otto's book, The Idea of the Holy, but also name-dropped Jamie Smith, who has helped others follow another Canadian philosopher named Charles Taylor, who I think you were using some of Taylor's language about immanent frame, buffered self. For those who are interested, How, in parentheses, Not to Be Secular is a helpful book. If you've never heard of Charles Taylor, this Canadian philosopher who uses these terms, shorthand, what do we mean in this description of trying to understand mythology in today's secular frame? A lot of what we've been talking about is in Rule 4. I just happen to have it open, and every time someone's mentioned something from A to B, trajectory heavenward, to kind of ask a question here, he ends with some of the not the Sermon on the Mount, but one of Jesus' statements in Luke 12 about the kingdom of God. And we've mentioned how he might have a lack of certain theological credentials. You can weigh in on that as you will from listening to him. But it's interesting how he says your trajectory is heavenward if you're aiming at this highest good. And he's referencing Jesus' statement about the kingdom of heaven.
Yes.
And that if you seek this first, the kingdom of God, his righteousness, and these things will be added unto you, right? That's not like because he happens to like the ring of it. There's something clearly intentional there. Paul, you want to weigh in on why you think he puts that there at the end of Rule 4? Like, what's his
Can you say that one more
meaning?
time, too?
The question?
The quote specifically.
Well, on the page, so if you even have a copy of the book, page 110 and 111, for anybody who wants to kind of know where I'm referencing, he has a long block quote from the Gospel of Luke, and Jesus' statement about consider the lilies of the field has to do with worrying, if you will, whether you're going to have food to eat, what's coming the next day. And the climax of that statement is seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added. And then after another paragraph, he concludes Rule 4 by saying, attend to the day, but aim at the highest good. And clearly this is a reference, right? Mm-hmm. Why would he do that?
He does it a lot.
He does it a lot. Peterson's use of, it's helpful. So one of the earliest things I wanted to try to figure out was, what does Peterson think the Bible is? Peterson believes that the Bible is a sort of crowdsourced, collective conscious wisdom that has been written down and has passed a sort of social Darwinian test of truth. And so I think many Christians will listen to a lot of his Bible quoting and think, wow, he's quoting the Bible. Yes, he is. What exactly he thinks this is about is not always so clear. Very quickly after I started making videos, some people, one individual who knows Peterson quite well, contacted me, and he and I exchanged quite a few emails. And one of the things that he said was, Peterson is very good at working with an audience, and he will tailor his use of language towards his audience. And as a preacher, well, I do this all the time too. So you want to be careful pushing some of these things too far, because then if you get into things like the resurrection, he'll say things like, we have no idea just how, if someone really, why doesn't he claim to believe in God? Because to use those words would bind someone to actually, in a sense, being able to fulfill it. And he doesn't believe he's worthy of that. Where that leaves everyone who does use that language, well, so it's really complicated. And I think for him, that as Andrew said, he is on a journey. And when someone asks him these questions, some people will say he's a charlatan. I have not seen anything from him that would lead me to believe that. I think he is honestly wrestling with it, but for him it's got to, I use the term natural theology, which I know is a little bit different from often natural theology, but he is trying to build that way up. And you get to a point where you can only build so far, and he often hits that point. Andrew.
Remember, his answer to the question, what's the question to ask? He says the journalist should be asking, what the heck is going on? And that's what he's doing too. He doesn't really know too.
No.
So I would say the wonderful thing about his journey is he's very intentional. He wants to journey well. He wants to figure things out.
Yeah.
And that's, to get back to the quote, it's someone who is earnestly trying to figure out what is the meaning.
Yeah.
What is the point?
Yeah. And he's always been that way.
Well, and if I may, one other thought. The thing that's really great about him is when whether we think that he's got the right meaning or not, and probably he doesn't, at least he recognizes that for those people that come to him and have problems in their lives, he's recognizing they're failing to do fundamental things that are essential for people to be real, to become substantive. And so that's just, I think that's the heartbeat of the most virtuous side of what he offers us.
He seems to be a strikingly honest empiricist who really approximates God.
Yeah, I think that's true. Anne was next.
So I'm glad you brought up the issue, the idea that he thinks the Bible is crowdsourced.
Yeah.
Because that's, from what I understand, that's how he developed the 12 rules.
Yes. Yes.
They were crowdsourced online.
Yes. Yes. And that's and so him, in terms of using the biblical language, in a number of cases, especially recently at the Liberty University things, he sees that, well, this is the best language we have. He doesn't quite know what to do with it, but he knows it works. He's a pragmatist. So, yes.
I'm the mom of 3 boys. At my son's elementary school, we had this group of militant moms that decided we had to remove the one play structure on the playground that my boys and all the other boys loved. It had a little bit of an element of risk to it.
Yep.
And a couple of them fell. There were never any broken limbs, but there were some skinned knees. And so against, some of us just saying, no, the boys have to have an outlet here.
Yes.
These militant moms got the structure removed, and the promise was it's going to be replaced with a beautiful little brook, and it'll be idyllic and peaceful, have water on the playground. Then when they finally ripped everything out, made this cement brook, they decided that 2 inches of water would be a danger to the children because they could slip. So what we were left with on the playground was a cement
ditch.
And I say that to illustrate the whole notion of safety, and you alluded to that at your beginning.
Somebody's going to run into that ditch.
Yeah, exactly. And I love the Christian counselor Leanne Payne, and something that she writes a lot about masculine, feminine, homosexuality, and she's so perceptive. And one of the things she says is that it's the feminine voice that calls us out in our early years, but for both boys and girls and adolescents, and they're coming into their understanding of themselves as masculine and feminine in their adult identities, that it's the male voice that's necessary to help us cross the bridge from childhood into young adulthood. It's the masculine voice that calls out to us. And in reading this book, I get the same feeling I do with Lewis. Lewis to me is like just brisk, cold water splashed on my face. I love his masculine energy.
Yeah.
And that even with that, and he's been accused of being, anti-women, but what does he do? He writes fairy tales.
Yes.
He writes children's stories, something that we would tend to think of as more maybe, feminine.
Yeah.
Just such a beautiful balance. And I feel like one of the reasons people are resonating so much to Jordan Peterson is he does balance out this toxic femininity that's just, I think we have much more of a crisis in masculinity than we do in femininity. It's our boys that aren't going to college.
Yeah.
It's our prisons that are being filled with young men.
Yeah.
And, we've tried to feminize, and women have done a great job of just labeling masculine energy as bad.
Yeah.
And here you have this guy with his, background as a psychologist, and I feel like he is resonating at a very deep level with all sorts of people, Christian and non-Christian, as that masculine voice. Stand up, put your shoulders back, pick up your cross, soldier on. This is a message that we really need, and young people really need, with all the emphasis on college of safe spaces and what the pablum that they're being fed. We need this cold water in the face approach.
I was just, the business of the 2-inch pond reminded me of the one about the statistician who drowned in a lake whose average depth was 6 inches.
Larry Kraft's whole body of work is about what Paul writing, my God will meet all your needs, and he breaks it down to our fundamental need for security and for significance. It seems the feminine side is your security, your safety, but our significance is real life has risk. Are we going to prepare our children for the real risk of the world?
Yeah.
And I think male voice, I guess, is more calling us out of that. We need both.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think one thing also is worth paying attention to is that unlike most contemporary psychologists and even self-help books, the view is that, well, be yourself and pursue your own path. It's up to you. So you fall into this subjectivist viewpoint, and that's exactly what Peterson is not saying again. So he keeps on falling back into saying that there is an objective series of standards that we're accountable to. He may believe it's crowdsourced, some sort of Darwinian process or something, but he knows that there is that standard there, and it isn't simply subjective. So I think that's, again, my point about his interest in Jung and so on and so forth. But then he leaps from this secular perspective into Dostoevsky and into Solzhenitsyn, neither of whom were subjectivist. And so he knows there is this standard, and he knows that that's what we should be paying attention to. So that, to me, getting back to what Andrew is saying, is that he is on this journey, but he knows it's not something he can just sort of improvise and make up on his own. He's saying the opposite.
And I'm sorry.
I think there was also an interesting time, I don't know if it was when he was with Sam Harris or which, but where he's asked about prayer. And I thought that was a really interesting answer.
Mm-hmm.
And you probably remember what it was. It was.
Yeah, yes, and you'll hear him talk a lot. I think Jordan Peterson gives us a window into what we would call his prayer life, where he sits at the edge of the bed and he recognizes that he's done wrong and that it was really wrong, and that if he wants to make amends and do right, and he asks it into the void, and as he said, an answer will come, and it won't be the answer you want. And yeah, yes, and even Sam Harris could agree he didn't know where that came from. So yes.
I say that in reading the book, that I found that he was walking purposely close to. I mean, the other side of pragmatism is utilitarian. And I think he walks a little, sometimes he seems to walk very close to that kind of approaching thing. In the medical field, he's out of the medical field. One of the things in the medical field that has become very interesting is looking at prayer in healing, and just kind of doing studies and trying to do other things, trying to analyze prayer as somehow a way of, because I think we see clinical correlation between prayer and healing, and trying to say, well, what is it in prayer that causes the healing there? And it's this kind of utility. How can we use this discipline, we would call it there, to improve condition there? And I think Peterson at times unfortunately tends to take these elements of Christian faith and so forth, and these disciplines, these building blocks there, and wants to kind of removes it from the person who provides the source and energy and the reason for that, and is trying to sort of look at it in their own, that has some kind of independent utility there, and he's kind of drawing on that kind of, the religious framework, but cutting it off from the source of it there, and therefore running very close to becoming this kind of utilitarian, or this kind of Tower of Babel kind of utilitarian approach to these deep structures that God has put into the world.
Now, you've been doing lectures on John Vervaeke, and who is a cognitive therapist?
Cognitive psychologist,
psychologist, who is doing something similar to what you were talking about. That he is, I think, clearly not a believer, although he is a practicer of Tai Chi and Buddhism, and he's trying to strip them from any spirituality, I'd say, but understand what in the practice is bringing people a sense of meaning. So he's trying to digest it. So I think that is something that's happening in the culture. However, okay, all of these, in my wanderings of reading, I came to N.T. Wright, probably from the premier Christian radio, who led me to Alistair McGrath, and who actually led me to Paul Tillich. And some of you are going to know Paul Tillich. And I've come to really think that there's something noble about not giving in to what everyone wants you to believe, but just struggling for what is the actual thing I believe in. And I feel like he's on almost like Paul Tillich's journey of what is God. If I believe in him, what is he? And I'm not going to take anybody else's idea, because I need to find this, grapple with this myself. So I feel like he's
the great will he or won't he debate. Yes.
It just dawned on me that his answer to the question whether he believed in God is just I act like I do. There's a point in the book where he denies that anyone's an atheist. He says,
yes.
You can't act like you do.
Yes.
You can't act like an atheist.
Yes.
Exactly.
And this drives,
That's the answer to the question.
he told Matt Dillahunty that. It drives them crazy. Yeah.
But
You can't be a nihilist.
But I think
and
the
function.
question for Christians reading him and following this is what he's teaching fully compatible. It doesn't matter whether he's a Christian or not, but is what he's saying fully compatible with what we believe? And that's the question I have.
What do you mean by compatible?
Can a Christian believe? Well, you can believe almost anything to be a Christian.
This is a Calvinist just said.
I know. He's an elder of a church in my denomination.
That's right.
Somebody who's not a Christian who reads this book make you being a Christian easier via their relationship with you.
I feel like,
I would say,
I mean, nobody agrees with anybody else on everything anyway. So one of my mentors says the person he likes the least is when, or the comment he likes the least is when someone recommends a book to him and says, oh, but you should know that I don't agree with everything. Well, I would be worried about you if you did. like you're like virtue signaling or something.
Yeah.
You know, it's like,
Yes, go ahead.
Well, two things. One, I was struck by the crowdsourcing because I just saw The Good Book, which is a play given in Berkeley about the Bible with the theory that it was crowdsourced.
Yeah.
And the other thing, and there's kind of two parts to it, but the main thing is that I was struck by the fact that here's a man who believes in truth, right? He's struggling to find it. He sees it only in the Christian religion, not in all his other mythologies. And it works. In fact, his rules are the only way to get through the chaos is to follow many of them. Now, Einstein had a theory, E equals mc squared, and they proved it by one prediction that, if it was true, would verify in scientists' mind that that was true. So here's Peterson with a multitude of beliefs that to live well you have to follow this model. But yet he will pray into the void like someone from the Enlightenment who believes that there can be spontaneous something out of nothing. Something comes back, but he won't say that it's God. And Jesus said, when he was looking at Jerusalem, and he wept, and he said, if only they would believe and know what peace was, the whole thing wouldn't stumble down. But they did not know the time of their visitation. And here's Peterson, for all his dancing and taking both the Bible as the primary source, and Campbell, where God is an invention of man so that they can survive. And he can't take that leap that Kierkegaard talked about. For whatever reason, intellectual or otherwise, that he can't even weigh the evidence that he puts together. He just refuses to put the sum at the bottom. And so it's pointless to me whether he ends up believing or not, but it's an interesting it's interesting how the human mind works, where you can develop all the evidence, and then refuse to come to the conclusion because of some other reason. I don't know what it is.
We're people.
Go ahead. I mentioned earlier how I found simplistic his approach to finding meaning, because he didn't seem to think it mattered which meaning you chose. Another case is in chapter 1, where he talks about the lobster, which has been around for 350 million years, and suggests openly that we should copy the lobster. If we did, the way he describes lobsters, and I'm not a lobster expert, we would all be bullies. It's not very compassionate at all.
Yeah.
I'm compelled to defend Peterson a bit. I think there's a point made earlier about essentially something along the lines that if you followed the 12 rules, you'd end up in somehow an extremist sort of camp somewhere. And there's a point made earlier that Peterson's about this balance and trying to between the line, chaos and order, and the examples of, he has a lecture on Nazi propaganda is really interesting. We find it really interesting. You know, check out one of his lectures. He talks about hyper order and people finding meaning in that, and he warns against that. I think this conversation you guys are having, wonderful about, you know, he's putting the pieces together, but someone also made the point that no one really knows where he's going. He doesn't know where he's going. Yeah. And he's asking all these questions of the Bible, of other source material, to try and find the way. So if he came to a conclusion, he already knows. It isn't the Google Maps, right? He doesn't just follow the dot. He's trying to find the way along with everyone else. Anyway, I'm compelled to, I feel it's offensive.
Do you think it's possible that, as Jung insisted, each individual has to struggle with this, who is God? That Peterson is refusing to connect all the dots because he wants every individual to struggle. Do you see any evidence that that's not a possibility?
That's one of the ongoing theories. You know, Peterson is really a Christian, but he's not saying it, and he's not going to join a church because that's going to put people off. I don't know how we can answer these questions. From everything that I've looked at Peterson, he would have a very difficult time figuring out exactly where to go, because there's all of these elements in him, from the Orthodox to the Roman Catholic to the evangelical impulses to mainline upbringing. When first asked, why don't you go to church? You know, the thing out of his mouth was, because I can't stand it. That's just who he is.
Well, like also his origin as a clinical psychologist, I feel like when he has somebody on the couch, so to speak, he's treating them as an individual. He's listening to them. He spent decades doing that and treating just with utmost respect where they're coming from, not where the Christian lens or the whatever lens it is, what society wants to take. He listened to them, and he's saying in this book that the way is through understanding how they got there and really understanding, like, for themselves, the individual journey. And that once they understand it, then they can set the aim and then go to the next, reach their potential from there. So it's like his tone is all in that clinical psychology. He's treating everybody like with no definitive answers, and that's why it works. That's why it works, in my opinion.
Yeah, he has a good balance also between the individual and the universal, I think. Because, 12 rules for life, that sounds very universal. But at the same time, in every chapter, it is very existentialist in the sense of you are here as a unique individual with your own problems that you have to face in your own way and find your own way to move forward, and no one else can do it for you. So he's always going back and forth between the universal, which includes the myth, that we all participate, and that, he's big into, civilization and tradition, which is what gets him in trouble in his political persona, because he says, we should listen to the traditions of the ages, and at the same time, he also says, you have to look within yourself and listen to your own conscience, and nobody else can look into your conscience for you. So I feel like that's another part of the balance that he's trying to emphasize.
Yep. Mark?
Briefly, on his autobiographical description of being raised in the church, someone help me out and correct this, but he mentioned something about his mom took him to church, and then it was probably like a Sunday school teacher or a pastor.
Yep.
We're talking about lying pastors, but one obviously ticked him off enough as like an adolescent to where certain questions were off limits, or there was just one dogmatic answer to a complex question.
Yep.
And I think he's not just used that as a trope to kind of give people, a little morsel. I think that's a significant part of how everybody naturally, when telling their own story of understanding, let alone the big mythological questions, religious questions, but in trying to find meaning or map meaning. Some of this is subjective. But in our, I've appreciated the debate about whether he believes in an objective. In some sense, you could say, as subjective as it sounds, it's really hard to read him and listen to him and not come to the conclusion that he clings to something objective. He doesn't want to say what it is. He just...
You can't say aim for your best self if you don't believe in something subjective, right? Objective. So he might claim that he's subjective in some sense, but his language is objective.
Each person decides their own best, so it is. I think I found sometimes, you mentioned at one point that he sometimes had a preacher. And I found that tone occurring a number of times when he spoke, and sometimes I got under my skin. Preacher. Very prescriptive about. Do this, aim for the best. Kind of like, at the same time, he has this kind of faith that the person's better nature will find that. He has kind of perhaps an under tendency to think that somehow, or else or else the people he's speaking to are nice people. He's expecting he's only going to speak to nice people who are going to who kind of have this underframe of kind of benevolence or something there. But that seems to be very prescriptive at times.
Yeah, he can be very. Sometimes when you listen to him, he's a little controlling father. You'll watch if you watch the Sam Harris talks. When he gets annoyed at Sam, he turns and complains to the crowd. He does that a number of times, which is very funny. And go ahead.
To get back to the part of him that is a clinician, there is something that he says about when you're trying to help a person get through and solve their problems. You may see how to solve their problems, but you never want to take that away from that person.
That's right.
And if you apply that to him saying, maybe you should go to church. I mean, does he want to supply the solution to everyone? He may not want to.
No. And he doesn't, I've been watching him with respect to the church, and I've used the phrase, he kind of Forrest Gumps his way around the church. The church is an astoundingly complex ecosystem with rules and habits and walls that make absolutely no sense to anyone who isn't in touch with the long history of conversations. So the fact that he bases a lot of his understanding on the church from the memory of a 12-year-old with an unfortunate Sunday school teacher, it's pretty understandable and forgivable.
Mama always said church was like a box of chocolate.
So I think we're now at about 9:30, and as I mentioned, we will continue the conversation in 2 weeks. Paul, perhaps that you want to...
Well, this has just been a delight. Well, one of the things Joey mentioned a little bit, he says, well, this sounds kind of like our meetup, but they have homework. We don't do homework at our... we don't do homework for our meetups, but this has been a delight hearing all of you and your insights, and I look forward to 2 weeks from now. If you haven't read the book or read much of the book, read more of it, because we'll go into some other sections 2 weeks from now that we haven't really delved into tonight. So,
also on the handout, on the back side is the schedule for the entire year. And for those of you you're not familiar, we do a book per month, 2 meetings. We also have some other things that we intersperse, like films and so on and so forth. So we welcome you to be involved on a more regular basis. We're thrilled that you were here. So thank you.